Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture on the Renaissance. It's important to know that the Renaissance takes place in a certain context. The Renaissance, as an Italian phenomenon, is largely associated with the city of Florence. And Florence acts as its own sovereign power. All right. Spain, France, and England, they all unify over the course of the Middle Ages, but Germany and Italy don't, for various reasons. And Italy remains a collection of states, statelets, okay, city-states like Venice, Milan, Genoa, Pisa for a while, Florence, the Papal States in Rome, okay. All of these things are their own independent countries. And they don't necessarily get along with each other. They are always jockeying for some kind of a power, all right, some kind of an advantage over their neighbors. And so there are like alliances, let's get together and gang up on the third guy, or, let's keep people divided and that sort of thing. So it's a real kind of a rat's nest, a hornet's nest. I don't know. It's some kind of a metaphor. And it is in this context that we have someone called Niccolo Machiavelli writing a book called The Prince, which was published in 1513. Now, maybe you've heard of Machiavelli before. All right, certainly the adjective Machiavellian is an adjective you hear in English from time to time. And it's not a compliment, is it? To describe someone as Machiavellian means that they look out for number one. They're always scheming and manipulative and learning to make alliances with people and then repudiate them at the first instance that they can, and so on. I recommend The Prince to you. It's not that long. It's got some good advice in there. Machiavelli, it is in fact a book of advice that was written by Niccolo Machiavelli to the Duke of Florence. Okay, the Medicis famously were dukes of Florence. And Machiavelli wanted his old job back, and so he wrote this book for his boss as a sort of, here's a gift for you. And let's just say that this is by no means the first book of advice that someone has written for a prince. Okay, prince in a general sense of like the monarch, the ruler, okay? Throughout the Middle Ages, there is a genre of literature, all right? It's called the Speculum Principis, which means the mirror of the prince. So the plural is specula principium, all right? The mirrors of princes. Most of the time, these books of advice are kind of like, they're like that book, Everything I Learned in Kindergarten. Or, there used to be Life's Little Instruction Book. And it's all about, they're these unworkable, there's these platitudes, okay? It's like a bad graduation speech. If you work really hard, you'll get your reward, okay? If you're nice to people, they'll be nice back. Machiavelli comes along and says, well, we all know that's not how the world works, okay? You don't, if you're nice to people, chances are they won't be nice back because people suck, basically. And so that's where this adjective comes from. It's important to realize that, though, that's a bit of an insult. If you read The Prince, you'll see that he doesn't recommend that you be amoral or manipulative or scheming on principle. It's just that, as he says, you've got a job to do. As head of the state, you have a job to do, and your job is to make sure that the state is secure. You need to maintain your position as the ruler of the state, and you need to guarantee the integrity of the state. All right? That's your first job. And whatever you do to do those things, is a good, okay? Even if you have to do evil deeds in order to maintain the integrity of the state, you should go right ahead, because if you don't do your job, if some other person invades, or if you allow someone to challenge your authority, you're going to have you're going to have violence, and far more people are going to suffer. Okay, so that's the whole thing about Machiavellianism. It's basically the world is full of choices, and none of them are particularly attractive. And so it is your job to choose the lesser of two evils. Okay, that's the thing about Machiavelli, to choose the lesser of two evils. So yeah, if you think someone is a threat to you, then you should take him out. All right? It's much better that one person should die than that the state should descend into civil war. Now, as you can probably imagine, effective rulers always operated on these principles. Okay, if you are a good ruler, you sort of instinctively, intuitively know how to manipulate people, how to guarantee your position. Okay, Machiavelli, though, he was the first person to actually write them down. All right, and so it was shocking, right? You're not supposed to say it. But Machiavelli was like, hey, we all know this is how the world works, so this is what we're going to do. All right. And here are some helpful hints from the Prince, which are actually, I've written them down because these are actually useful in many other jobs. Okay. Any kind of management position might benefit from these points. Okay. So here is some helpful hints. This might actually help you in your career. Don't say that Western Civ is useless. All right. Machiavelli places a great emphasis on image. All right. Reputation. You should at all times try to burnish your reputation, in his case, as a Christian. All right. So you are seen going into church, you are seen at mass, you are seen participating in a religious ritual. You give money to the church. You make sure everyone knows that you've given money to the church. Okay. You want everyone saying, "Oh, he's a good Christian." He's a good Christian. Which means that if you have a reputation, you can sort of kind of act the way you want, and it'll be quite a long time before people kind of notice the gap between your image and your actual behavior. What is it? Mark Twain once said that give a man a reputation as an early riser, and that man can sleep until noon. Okay. It's true. You can coast a long time on a reputation, on an image. You just have to make sure that you buttress your image at every opportunity. Okay? And famously, it is better to be both feared and loved, but if you have to choose, it is better to be feared than loved. Okay? And this is like Machiavelli's kind of worldview. All right? When things are going well, everybody wants to be your friend. When you get into trouble, your friends often aren't around, right? We've all had this experience. You get into some spot of bother, and your friend all of a sudden isn't available. So this is something that leaders have to deal with. So what you want is you want people to love you, but you also want them to be afraid of you. All right. So what you want is you want people saying about you, he's a nice guy, but don't cross him. Okay. That's what you want people saying about you. And frankly, it is more important to make people afraid of you than to love you. I mean, love is ephemeral, but fear, I mean, that will really concentrate someone's mind. So you want to make sure that you also have a reputation of being, don't cross someone. He will wreak revenge on you. Now, you don't want to be hated, okay? That's the thing. You don't want to be hated. If you are hated, then you will provoke a rebellion. All right, and you don't want that. You want people to be afraid of pissing you off, so they will try very hard not to do that. Okay, our third point there is to be stingy. All right, don't raise people's expectations. This is, this is a piece of advice that has been very useful to the president of Reinhardt. Okay, um, particularly the previous one. He would come to us and he would say how awesome we are, how wonderful we are, and how the faculty is just great, and this place runs. It wouldn't be Reinhardt without you. Here's a quarter. Okay. He would never put his money where his mouth is. Uh, he would just be very, very stingy. And this, as much as I hate to say it, was good policy on his part. Okay, because again, people are fickle, they are selfish, they are greedy. And if you, as a boss, are in the habit of giving like a 5% raise, people will be grateful for that for about 2 weeks. Then they'll be back to complaining about everything else that's wrong. And the next year, I mean, the 5% raise is the new normal. They're going to expect that the next year, right? So the point is, you don't want to get into that situation. You don't want to get into the habit of rewarding people for what they're worth. Or but worse, to give them extra normal rewards. You will not buy people's loyalty by giving them stuff. All right. Because if you do that, you're going to have to start raising taxes on everyone else. You're going to have to start robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you don't want to do that. You want everyone to be really, really grateful for like an extra dollar. Okay, man, that guy's stingy, but oh, he gave me $1. Wow, he must be a great guy. Okay, so yes, so you wanna don't raise people's expectations. You should not mind getting the reputation of being a miser. A prince should know when to break his word. Again, politicians do this all the time. But that's, here's Machiavelli actually saying this. Okay? You shouldn't get a reputation of being a liar. You shouldn't get a reputation of being untrustworthy. But if you need to go back on a promise you've made, then go right ahead and do that. That's no biggie. Okay, and you don't acknowledge it, and it's just something that happens, and oh, don't know how that happened. But yes, you do need to be able to do that. And then here's another one from Reinhardt. We'd come every at start of every year. You'd come in to hear the state of the college address, and the president would be up there saying how everything is great. And then in the afternoon, you'd go to the faculty senate meeting, and the provost would get up and say how all the problems we've got. Okay, so this is very Machiavellian, and I think it was done on purpose. You want to be associated with popular stuff. You want to get your underlings to break. You don't want to be associated with that. Just some very simple things to do that will help you in your career if you ever go into management. Now, is this Renaissance? I would say that it is. Okay, we talked last time about the Renaissance and how there's this man is the measure of all things, and there's this sense of possibility, and you can become, you can do whatever you want. You can improve through self-will. And when you improve yourself, you raise everyone. Yes, that is very much part of the Renaissance. But there's also a kind of a dark side to the Renaissance, or at least there is man is the measure of all things. Let's look at humans as they actually are. Let's not be thoughtlessly idealistic. And that too is part of the Renaissance. You want to be honest. You want to look. Okay, people are fickle. They are greedy. They are selfish. And if you want to rule them, you have to take that into account. And so here is Machiavelli actually writing all this stuff down. So as I say, I do recommend this book to you if you ever have the chance to read it. Here is another aspect of sort of the new politics. Okay. And this is more about aspiration. All right. The Prince was a book of advice to the prince. Baldassare Castiglione, who was from Urbino, which had the Count of Urbino. He gave a book of advice to the courtier. Okay? Every duke or count or prince has to have a court, right? People who are allowed to hang out with him. And, the more people you have at court and the more prestigious they are, the better you look. All right? So, I don't know. It sounds to me like being at court was really kind of boring. Okay? But, and again, it's a pit of vipers. All right? There's always people are envious of each other. They're jockeying for position. Because you want to gain the prince's trust, you want to gain his confidence, and then maybe he'll give you some job that you can do, which will give you prestige. It might get you a little bit of money and so on. So how do you behave at court? What are you going to do at court in order to attract the prince's attention? And Castiglione recommended basically to be a courtier, you need to be a Renaissance man. You need to develop all manner of skills. Okay, you need to dance, duel, you need to be a good swordsman, you need to be able to paint, compose poetry, play music, speak different languages, be witty, okay? And all with sprezzatura, which is an Italian word meaning gracefulness and lack of visible effort. All right, so never let them see you sweat, right? You may have written that beautiful poem. It took you 3 days, but you never acknowledge that. Oh yes, here's something I just dashed off. You say as you move gracefully in your stylish clothing. All right, that's the key. And again, this is not something you'd find in the Middle Ages. This really is aspirational, right? You can do this. You can improve through self-will. And here are all the ways you can improve. Now, I really doubt there was ever a courtier who met all these criteria. But the fact is that things are possible now, and it can be held up as some kind of an ideal. So these are two political things, okay? A book of advice for the prince and a book of advice for the courtier, all right? Okay, now we switch our attention away from Italy and more towards the rest of Europe. It is judged that 1494 is the turning point here. 1494 marks the beginning of the end of the Italian Renaissance, but it also marks the beginning of when the Renaissance spread to the rest of Europe. The French invaded, basically, and then they brought the Renaissance back to France with them. Obviously, though, it's going to take different forms in different places. Remember that at heart, the Renaissance is about language and about textual analysis. And the Renaissance was very keen on pagan authors like Cicero, Virgil, Livy, Ovid, all right? Let us read these pagan authors. Let us improve our Latin after these pagan authors. And you know what? Just because they're pagan doesn't mean they don't have some good ideas. And so we're gonna adopt some of their pagan ideas. We'll remain Christian, but we'll see that this world that we're living in is not so bad, and we're going to try to improve it. Okay, well, that's the whole notion of going back to the text and gleaning what we can out of the text. This is an idea that finds purchase in Northern Europe. And it is chiefly associated with a scholar by the name of Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, which of course is in the Netherlands. All right. Now Erasmus is much like Petrarch. He is a scholar. He writes great volumes of work. He corresponds in letters with people all over the place, so he's very well connected. And he is very keen on this notion of humanist textual sort of analysis. All right. Except he's not as keen on pagan authors as he is on Christian authors. Okay. he wants to use techniques of humanist critical inquiry in order to expose truths about Christianity. Okay? So he's not interested in publishing an authoritative edition of Cicero or Virgil or Ovid as much as he is in publishing an authoritative version of the Bible. Okay? And if we're talking about the Bible, or particularly the New Testament, we're going to be talking about the Greek New Testament. The Bible, well, all of the books of the New Testament were composed in Greek. Every now and then there's an Aramaic word, right? Or phrase. But on the whole thing was written in Greek. So that means if we're really serious about our Bible, we're going to learn Greek so that we can read it in the original. We're not going to be happy with translating it into Latin. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church endorses the Latin Bible, but that is not good enough if you are a humanist. You want to go back ad fontes, meaning to the source. And the source in this case is the Greek. So of course Erasmus learns Greek in order to be able to read the Greek New Testament. And he wants to publish, with the printing press, he wants to publish an authoritative Greek New Testament. So he goes around and collects as many Greek manuscripts as possible. And he is surprised, or perhaps not surprised, to discover that they don't necessarily agree with each other. They all differ in certain points of detail. So this is always a puzzle. This is always a challenge for a humanist, and that is to establish what did the original text look like. Okay? Now, we've talked about philology. Okay? You can you can chart how words come in and out of fashion. So if you've got a Bible with a word in it that comes in the 7th century, well, you know that someone has inserted that word, and you can get rid of that word in favor of the other reading of the text that has the word from the 1st century in it. Okay, so that's easy enough to do if you have a sufficient philology under your belt. But Erasmus also makes a certain commentary about the content as well. All right. So the point is that if you have variant readings of the Greek New Testament, one of which supports church doctrine and another of which doesn't, Erasmus picks the one that does not support church doctrine. Okay? And so you see what he's doing there. He's basically accusing the Catholic Church of being a bad steward of the Bible. He's accusing the Catholic Church of saying, you've monkeyed with this text in order to justify yourself. And that's wrong. Okay? So as you can see, Erasmus was deeply Christian, deeply committed as a Christian, but like many people at the time, he was skeptical of the Roman Catholic Church. He was upset and disappointed by the gap that he saw between the church's ideals and its reality. And also Erasmus had some, well, perhaps eccentric ideas of what he thought Christianity should be. Now, he was never charged with heresy, but he was, being a humanist, he believed in going back to the source. And the source for him was textual, and the source is the Bible. And so Erasmus becomes very keen on the notion that all Christian practice should be referenced by the Bible. Okay? And that's where Praise of Folly comes in. That's another one of his famous works. It was a condemnation of all sorts of popular Christian practice. All right, all that stuff. Rosary beads, lighting a candle in front of a statue of St. George. Oh, if you see a statue of St. Christopher, it means you won't die that day. If you write out a prayer to St. Barbara and eat it, then you'll get certain things, okay? So it's very much, it's popular piety, but it's mechanistic and it's kind of negotiating with God. If I do this thing, you'll do this for the thing for me, right? And that Erasmus says that is not how we should be as Christians. I mean, we should be have the love of God in our heart. Okay, let's go back to what Jesus recommended. It's not about the rules you follow. You have the love of God in your heart, and you get that by reading the Bible. Okay, you go to the Bible and you see these things. You strip away the centuries of tradition and rule bending that have crept in. And so it's not just a condemnation of popular piety. Erasmus also has a great deal of ire for the papacy, and that's where that third book there comes in. Julius Excluded from Heaven was a satire that he wrote. Julius is Pope Julius, and the book has Pope Julius dying, and he goes to heaven. And St. Peter, of course, is at the pearly gates, and St. Peter, of course, was the first pope. And St. Peter's, Julius says, "Step aside, I'm coming through." And Peter says, "Why should I let you in?" He says, "Well, you're the pope, I'm the pope, what's the big deal?" And then Peter says, "Well, I was the pope back before it was cool, all right? And I was actually martyred for my faith. What did you do?" And he lists all the crimes that Pope Julius had committed. And keep in mind, Pope Julius is a political player on the Italian scene, and so Pope Julius is engaged in all sorts of Machiavellian maneuvering. And St. Peter sort of runs through a great list of all these unchristian acts that Julius has committed, and Julius is like, "But I'm the Pope. Whatever I do is good." Okay? That's no biggie. Whatever I did for the good of the church. And St. Peter says, "No, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. You are not a good Christian. You're not coming in here." And so the work ends with Julius saying, "Fine, I'm going to go down to hell. I'm going to raise an army of demons, and I'm going to come back here and take this place by force." Okay? So that is Julius Excluded from Heaven. I assure you this was very scandalous at the time that people would speak of the Pope in such terms. In fact, Erasmus published it anonymously at first. But it's part of the times, really, that people are doing this sort of thing against the papacy. And at the time, we'll talk about him later, Martin Luther, of course, launched the Protestant Reformation. People say that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. That without Erasmus, there would have been no Luther. That is, that Erasmus conditioned people to believe that the source of Christian practice should be the Bible. All right. The Catholic Church has a different view of things, and we will talk more about that. But for the time being, Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. But ultimately, Erasmus did not join Luther's Reformation. Erasmus said, Luther did a number of things. Okay, one of which is that he broke away from the church. That was what Erasmus didn't like. Okay, Erasmus believes in reforming the church, but he doesn't believe in breaking it apart. So Erasmus, on the one hand, he liked what Luther was doing, but on the other hand, he was deeply skeptical of what Luther was doing. Okay. Another figure of the Northern Renaissance was Erasmus's friend Thomas More. You may have heard of Thomas More. In fact, he is a saint in the Catholic Church because, like Erasmus, he was a humanist, but he refused to go along with the Reformation. And the Reformation in this case was Henry VIII's Reformation that created the Church of England. Okay? More refused to countenance that and paid for it with his life in 1535. So he is a Catholic martyr, and from time to time you see schools or churches named for St. Thomas More. So prior to this, and if you're interested in a dramatic depiction of this, there's a wonderful play by Robert Bolt called A Man for All Seasons, which talks about Thomas More as this great prisoner of conscience and going to the scaffold, basically the king's good servant, but God's first. Okay. Anyways, before that dramatic episode, Thomas More was a humanist, and he was a politician. He was Lord Chancellor of England. In 1516, he published a very influential book called Utopia, which is a word that he coined. All right? It is from Greek meaning no place. Some people think it means good place, but you know, EU at the beginning of a word is good. All right, so like euphemistic or euphoric, that means good, but OU is no, and utopia should have an O in front of it. Okay, so utopia is no place. All right, although I'm sure that More cherished the ambiguity because it takes the form. Here is 1516, all right, this is the age of European discovery. Columbus has discovered America, 1492, and there's a kind of like, cool, let's go out there, let's explore. There's a whole world, and people would write about their adventures, and they would publish these adventures, and people would read them. Very interesting, okay? And Utopia is a book that takes the form of this kind of travel literature. A guy meets someone who claims he has sailed out into the Atlantic and he has discovered this island, which he calls Utopia. And it is, it's, well, as I have there, it is a return to the classical idea of imagining the ideal society. Okay, that was a favorite pastime of the Greeks, right? Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics are all about analyzing the constitutions of a particular city-state and imagining what would the perfect society look like? What would be a good society? And so Utopia is a kind of revival of that. All right. And if you go to, it's a thought experiment. If you read Utopia, you think there's no way this could work. All right. And so you see, there's no private property in Utopia. There are strict sumptuary laws. All right. That is, we're all going to be dressing simply, kind of like the Amish. You can see there that Thomas More didn't believe that. He's dressed in furs. All right. Everyone would take their meals in common. Okay, if you fall on hard times, there's a welfare state that will step in to help you out. There's going to be freedom of religion. Okay, and so yeah, it's Thomas More. In fact, has been idealized by communists. They think that he is, he was kind of like Karl Marx before his time. As I say, it's probably, if you're a farmer working in the fields, the last thing you want to do when you come home at night is spend 3 hours studying, which is what Thomas More suggested the utopians do. But on the whole, as I say, it's a thought experiment, and it is a critique of More's England. Okay, so More's England was characterized by vast disparities of wealth, by greed, by avarice. Okay, and so Utopia is kind of an inverse of that. It's like, wouldn't it be great if society looked like this and not like what we have now? So Utopia, of course, has entered in the English language. It's like Catch-22. It's originally the book title that becomes a general word. So we talk about a utopian scheme or a utopian commune. It comes to us originally from More, and it is part of the Renaissance because it's like, it's about reviving a classical idea, and it's also about imagining what could we do here? What would be, how would we improve this place? Okay, so those are a couple of participants in the Northern Renaissance, Erasmus and Thomas More. Okay, finally, we'll just talk a little bit about art and architecture in the North. As you can see here, this is what architecture looks like in the 16th century in England. Neoclassical architecture, it seems, remained in Italy. That is not an idea that came north, or eventually it does. But in the 16th century, Gothic continues, and it enters a sort of late phase known as perpendicular. Perpendicular Gothic, and you can see that so-called fan vaulting on the top. So if you want to go to England and you want to see some fan vaulting, go to King's College in Cambridge, all right, which is this beautiful example of fan vaulting. Or don't go there. Just wait for Christmas time when they have the 9 lessons and carols from King's College, Cambridge, and they'll show that on PBS, and you'll get some glorious views of the King's College Chapel. If you go to London, go to Westminster Abbey and make sure that you go to the Lady Chapel on the East End. That is known as Henry VII's Chapel, and that is also another fine example of perpendicular Gothic. Okay, so Gothic architecture keeps on going in England and keeps on developing. So that's an example of the Renaissance that didn't take place. I've been mentioning about printing, okay? How a Renaissance humanist loves to find manuscripts and loves to imagine what the original text looked like and then to publish that text using the printing press. Okay, that is a very humanist activity. Now, the printing press, or I should say, movable type, is an invention by the brothers Gutenberg in Mainz, in Germany. Okay, they're jewelers actually, and they came up with this idea about, hey, instead of, we could print a woodcut. Okay, we could carve all the letters out of a block of wood and print as many copies of that as we want. But if we wanted to print a whole book, that would be a lot of effort. You'd have to individually carve out each page, and then it wouldn't be worth it. You might as well just copy the whole thing out by hand. But it seems that they had this bright idea of, why don't we carve out 100 A's, upper and lower case, 100 B's, 100 C's, and so on. And then we can actually set the type in a page, print off 100 copies, and then we can break up the type and then reset page 2 and print 100 copies of page 2. This isn't quite how it works, but you get the idea. It's like Legos, okay? You can put it together in any form you want, and then you can break it up and make something else. And so this was a great leap forward, really. And so once you have this technology, it spreads every city before long, and there's a printer or two that starts up, and all sorts of things that used to be copied out by hand very laboriously can now be set in type and print as many copies as they want. So this is, as I say, it's a great leap forward. The first book that the the Gutenberg brothers published was, well, the Bible, okay. And there is a page from the Gutenberg Bible, a folio in the words, okay. It's taken from Wikipedia. That is the first book of the book of Judges, okay, Judi. And you wouldn't really know that this was produced by movable type, okay? But it was, okay? It was made to look like it was done in a scriptorium, though, all right? Because at the time, I mean, a book was written out by hand by a team of scriveners, okay? You would, just to make a book by movable type is kind of like going to Walmart and buying a cheap knockoff of a name brand. So that's what the Gutenberg Bible was like. And so you can see in there, I mean, it looks like it was done by monks. You've got abbreviation marks, okay? Anything with a line over it, that is an abbreviation, okay? It makes things easier to write out by hand, but you need an extra character if you're setting it in type. All right, but that doesn't matter. You want to make it look like it's done on a manuscript, and you can see the initial there. That was done by hand. Okay, so they would print it out, and they couldn't help themselves. They went back and they did a few things by hand to try to class up this manuscript. Okay, they wanted to make it look like it was done in a monastic scriptorium. And, as I say, it was a cheap knockoff at the time. But man, if you have a Gutenberg Bible now, that's tens of millions of dollars, okay? This is the first book published by movable type in the West. Even a single page will set you back, tens of thousands of dollars, all right? So that is, if you get a Gutenberg Bible, man, you're set. But at the time, as I say, it was a cheap knockoff, and so they tried to make it look like it was done by hand in a scriptorium. And I have to say, once again, I must say this, it was the first book published by movable type in the West. Okay, in fairness, have to say that the Chinese invented movable type several hundred years previous. Okay, the trouble is that movable type is not necessarily useful for Chinese script, okay, because they never moved into an alphabetic script. They retained an ideographic script, which means, it's not like they have 26 letters. They've got 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 characters, okay, so it's just to be in a Chinese print shop, most of the space is going to be occupied by the characters. And then, of course, you have to have some kind of means of arranging it because there is no alphabetical order in Chinese. So movable type, I mean, the Chinese invented it first. Westerners invented it later. But it is more useful an invention in the West than in China. Okay, so printing comes to Italy. Okay, printing comes to Italy, and very quickly, the Italian Renaissance humanists, they don't particularly care for that hexagonal black letter Gothic face. They take the same attitude towards black letter that they did towards Gothic architecture. This is old. It's ignorant. It's superstitious. It's monkish. We don't want this anymore. So what they did, they devised a whole new set of fonts, okay, that were not hexagonal. They were more rounded. These are so-called Roman fonts. And if you are writing in Ciceronian Latin, you will set it in one of these fonts. Okay. Nowadays, we've lost this notion that a different language requires its own font. Okay. Nowadays, on your word processor, you can pull down the font menu and select whatever damn font you want. But there was a time when if you were writing, say, in Irish, you would have to use an Irish font. If you were writing in Latin, you would use a font that looked like this. Now, again, it's not a slavish copying of Roman letters. Okay, there are plenty of Roman inscriptions around. Obviously, the upper cases were derived from those inscriptions. Lowercase, the Romans didn't have lowercase. So again, the Renaissance humanists didn't throw out lowercase just because the Romans didn't use it. But they wanted a font that was graceful and legible, and that's what we have, and that is the ancestor of most fonts in use today, except in Germany, which is very interesting how it's just as Gothic architecture held out in England, so also does black letter hold out in Germany for a long time. and it becomes a badge of national pride. Okay, and so for you see that sort of black letter or Fraktur font, bespielt unter schwäbischer Victor Jagdwolf Burgkämpfer. All right, that is, I mean, heavy metal bands will use that font, right, because they want to project a kind of badass Teutonic image. So these fonts, the black letter, only fell out of use in Germany in the 20th century. And on the bottom there, I have this is an article I got in Interlibrary Loan. The title is Zur Geschichte der Fête des Fous. All right, Zur Geschichte der means on the history of, and then the Fête des Fous is the Feast of Fools. But Fête des Fous is in French. All right. So here is an example of you have to have the right font for the right language. All right. And in the das Narrenfest Fête des Fous oder wie es auch genannt wurde, das Edelsfest Fête de l'An. All right. You see Fête des Fous and Fête de l'An are both in French. They're both set in a different font than the German, which remains in black letter. Okay. Finally, here is another example of Northern art. There is a whole history of Northern European Renaissance art. It's focused largely in the Netherlands and Burgundy, all right? And of course, they use a lot of the things that the Italians have discovered, including perspective. But Northerners liked working in oil more than frescoes. And here is a famous portrait by Jan van Eyck, the Arnolfini portrait. It's there's a number of enigmatic things in here. This is, it's either an engagement picture. The question is she pregnant? Okay, she's holding up her dress. Is that covering up a baby bump? Clearly, he's a rich merchant. The key here, and of course the sandals. What do that mean? The dog, is that a symbol of fidelity, and so on. But the thing about oils is that they take a very long time to dry. So you can afford to spend a great deal of time getting the details just right. And that's a characteristic of Northern Renaissance paintings, is they worked in oils and they are very finely detailed. So that mirror in the back is surrounded by 12 sort of little portraits on each of those protrusions. If you had this real painting and you looked closely, there are little miniature portraits in that. Van Eyck made sure to do that. All right, and you can see the chandelier is very detailed. The dog, the individual hairs on the dog are seen. So that's just another way that the Renaissance is a little bit different outside of Italy. Okay. So with that, we end our talk about the Renaissance, and we will move next week into talking about the Reformation.